We want to talk about the position of women in law, in various leadership positions in law, whether it's the bench, the bar, academia. How are they doing? Have we seen an improvement in this? There's a new report that was released recently. Actually, I think it was launched yesterday. And the founder and executive director of the Institute for African Women in Law, Professor Japa Dawuni, is with us in the studio. We welcome her the way we welcome our guests. She gets to hear the day's proverb first.
Yes, our proverbs for the whole of this week are from the country of Namibia, whose capital is?
That one.
Okay. Windhoek, but pronounced?
Windhoek.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Right. An old monkey never forgets to climb trees.
An old monkey never forgets to climb trees.
Yes. The moment the word forget is instilled in that proverb, then it means it's something that the monkey had done. So we are referring to the likelihood of the monkey forgetting certain routines that it was accustomed to, perhaps in a younger age.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we say that is impossible.
That really is not within the realms of impossibility. Not really. No.
Forget everything else, but
Climbing trees, no.
you won't forget that. You won't forget that. Professor Dawuni, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kenya's Biggest Conversation.
Thank you.
Good to
Glad
have
be
you
here.
on the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with that proverb. An old monkey never forgets to climb trees. What's your interpretation of it?
I think it quite maybe similar to the one we've heard. Once you learn how to ride a bicycle, you never forget. But I don't know in this case if there's some level of biological determinism that it's just part of the monkey's biological makeup to climb trees. And if we were to extrapolate that onto human existence, I think it's just like you said, some of the routines, the things we do, the things we are brought up. We could also go into the socialization we receive as children. And then as a feminist, womanist, I would say that it can also go into the gendered roles that we are brought up with. So once we learn those things, we don't forget. But I think in this case, when it comes to gender constructs, we can unlearn and hopefully forget.
Okay.
The bad ones.
The bad ones.
Yeah.
You call yourself a feminist womanist. Is there a distinction between the two?
There is some level of epistemological distinction, and I'll try and I'll try not to use and I'll try not to throw too many of those words here. And that for some people, the feminist movement, it's really at the core about women's equality and equality in society. But if you look at it, it's gone through different waves. So, for example, most feminists in the United States, where I teach and live, we have the distinction between white feminists, black feminists, African American feminists, and then of course we have African feminists, Asian feminists. It's really kind of morphed into different. And there's been some distinctions and tensions where some people feel that feminism has been taken over by white feminists. So the word feminist denotes white feminism. And others who are black or brown, but they say, where are we featuring in this discourse? So within the African American context, they developed the idea of womanism to bring it closer home to the African roots of what it means to be a woman. So Alice Walker, for example, has been credited highly with this idea of womanism, which looks more from the communal perspective, not the individual perspective. So that's where those distinctions come. And I think I straddle both.
Okay. All right. You founded the Institute for African Women in Law. What's it about?
Yeah, so that was founded in 2015, and I would say it was born out of my frustration as a scholar. Because I qualified as a lawyer in Ghana. I did my PhD in political science at Georgia State in Atlanta, Georgia. So once you finish your PhD, you're thinking, what's going to be my research focus? I could do something in law, I could do something in international development, which was my master's, and I could also do something in politics. And I decided after 5 years of law school, I wasn't going to throw that away. So I wanted to bridge the gap between politics and law, and most importantly, my interest in women and gender issues. And I decided to start researching on women in law. I noted that as I did more research, I couldn't find a lot that had been written. So I said to myself, if nobody's writing it, or nobody's writing it consistently, then that means there's a problem, there's a gap. I'm a problem solver, so I decided to solve that problem. So 2016, I edited my first book on women in gender and the judiciary in Africa. And I'll say it's the first ever book to be written on women judges in Africa. So that was 2016, and I followed up soon after that with a second book, a third and a fourth book. So that passion for research led me to create an organization that would conduct research on women in law, but also importantly, look at the gaps that we are finding in the research and provide training and other capacity enhancement. So that's how the Institute was formed, and that's where we are today.
I mean, by the time somebody's going into research, there's a problem, isn't it? That's something you want to find out about, or something that you want to then be able to fix as a result of that research. So, and you talk about gaps. What are these problems, or what are these gaps then that would lead to research on women in leadership, or women in law, women on the bench in Africa?
Yeah, good point. So yeah, there's always that issue that there's a problem to be fixed, or there's a question to be answered. The good thing is that sometimes it's not a problem. It's just a matter of really understanding deeper and maybe finding alternatives or finding solutions. So for me, the problem in this case, and looking at it from a research perspective, the problem statement was, for me, where are the African women in law? I knew I was one of them. I knew there were many women across Ghana, across the continent, but we couldn't find that. So my first book, if you look at it, Gender in the Judiciary, was what I call painting the landscape, or trying to understand the landscape of, okay, who is a judge? How do they become a judge? What do they do when they get into the judiciary? What are the problems they face? What are the contributions they are making? So even though it was more of a problem with the lack of knowledge, it wasn't a problem with the fact that women were necessarily having too many problems. Given, and this is something we'll talk about maybe in a few more minutes, is that we see that across the continent of Africa, women have entered the legal professions broadly, at the judiciary, the bench, and the bar, but they still have challenges they face. And these are the challenges that need to be highlighted, but most importantly, I'm all about celebration. Because growing up, like, if I can segue very quickly, I never law wasn't something I wanted to do. I wanted to be an architect, but I couldn't draw a straight line. People looked at me and thought, you should be a teacher. You're gentle, you're kind. People thought you should be a nurse because you're just nice. People get well when they see. I'm like, okay. But I always say that this is where it gets gendered, because nobody ever told me be a doctor. It was a nurse. And we heard this a lot yesterday during the launch, where the pioneer women judges who were in the room, Justice Effie, Justice Aloch, and even CJ herself and Chief Justice Kome, talked about how they were told to be a nurse or a teacher or something else. So why wasn't I told to be a doctor? Anyway, I don't like blood, I don't like chemistry and physics, so I could never have been a doctor. But I walked into a salon in Ghana one time. I saw a magazine that was just lying there, and I was really young, 18. And I looked in there and I saw a young woman from the United States who was at that time 19 years old. She had a PhD, she had a law degree, and I said, I want to be like her. I cut out the picture out of the magazine, and to date I have it. Over 30 years, I still have that picture, and that inspired me. So for me, being a lawyer was the first step to figuring out how can we solve problems. And if I wasn't going to go to the courtroom to solve the problems that my cases were going to be about, then I wanted to be in the classroom, furthering the knowledge, and most importantly, also advancing knowledge. And that's where I got into the field.
What would you say? Okay, so in terms of representation, in terms of women then being in these fields where, this particular field, we know that they're there. Would you say that today, on the continent, even as you sat amongst these powerful women in that launch yesterday, would you say that the representation or the entrenchment to guarantee that women are in these positions has improved over time? 30 years ago, when you saw that, and then practicing over time, and then coming in today, would you say that it has improved? Is there now an embracing of a culture then that admits women into these circles?
Absolutely. And I'll give Kenya as an example. So one thing I always like to say when I'm doing my research, my speaking engagement, is that Africa is a continent. It is not a country. Don't expect me to come here and tell you Africa. So I have developed the habit of saying across Africa. I like to write and say across Africa to show the expanse of this huge heterogeneous continent. And so for that reason, I tell people it's over 1 billion people and counting, thousands of cultures, thousands of languages, if not in the millions. So I always like to nuance my explanations and examples. So back to your question. Across the continent, and I tell people I'm not going to come and tell you I'm an expert on Africa. If anybody tells you they are, tell them they're a liar, because you're talking about 54 nation states. They cannot possibly know everything. So I'm very proud to say that and shy away from saying I'm an expert on Africa. However, given the work I have done across different countries, and I'm a comparativist, I go to the field, I do research, so I'm on the ground and learning. And given what I've been also studied from other places I'm yet to visit, there has been progress in many places across the continent. You find out that yes, 30 years ago compared to now, there's been a lot of shifts. And so we're getting more women getting into law school, getting into the different branches of the profession. The numbers are increasing in some countries and not in others. In one country, you might find out the numbers may be increasing in the number of women in the judiciary, but not so much in the number of women in the academy. Another thing is the distinction between the representation in numbers versus the representation in leadership. So let me take Kenya as an example. The research we have done shows that, of course, the judiciary of Kenya has about 50% women judges generally. What distinguishes Kenya from other places is that Kenya also has almost 50 or more percent of women in leadership. So the representation, what we call the symbolic representation, is kind of equal to the leadership representation. But that is not the case in other countries.
Something I'd like to ask. You alluded to a distinction in feminism based on the geographical area that one comes from. So let me ask the question. Asia, the Western world, Africa, when you look at this definition of feminism, where do they converge? Where do they differ?
Yeah, that's a deep question. So I think the convergence would be maybe to a large extent that we all are focused on the equality of women. So at the basic level is the idea of fighting for and advancing women's equality across board. But it's also different because feminism is based on lived experiences. And one of the things you find with knowledge production, like it or not, the knowledge production is highly regulated by power. So what we know as knowledge systems, and you may have heard about this within the context of the African knowledge systems, is what we have this movement of decolonizing knowledge. We've been made for many years to believe that who we are, what our systems are, how we operate, is objective, it's based on research. But we are now deconstructing to realize that those who created those knowledge systems had power. They created these systems that we use to describe ourselves. And so we have to deconstruct that knowledge. So even that with feminism, in as much as we're advocating for equality, you also find that it's based on power structures. And that is where women from the continent of Africa, women from Latin America or Asia, stepping back and looking at this thing we've painted called feminism and asking, it doesn't really look like me. That is not my lived experience. Why should I be told that I should be a certain way of being in order to be considered a woman, to be considered a feminist? So it's really constant shifts, and that has taken place even at a global level. If you're looking at the women meetings convened by the UN, which one of them was held in Nairobi, I think in 1975 or 85. I always forget the year. I think the Nairobi conference was 85. It started off in Mexico, Nairobi, Copenhagen, ended up in Beijing. There were many tensions with the women when they met because some groups of women wanted to take over the agenda.
Some groups of women?
Yes, some groups of women, and I think you want me to go deeper into that.
That's why there was silence.
So, yes, we're waiting for
Pause, take a deep breath, and then continue. Yes.
So some groups of women, and I'll be very open about this, is that it was what we classify, I think back to your question about geography,
Yes.
is that Western feminists took over the agenda, and you will talk to people who have been to these meetings, and it was really a silencing and erasure of the other women. So quote unquote other is another word we use in the decolonized knowledge systems, feminist systems. Who is the other? And there's a very powerful article that was written by an Indian feminist scholar, Mohanty Chandra Talpade, who talks about under Western eyes, and how Western knowledge systems and knowledge ways of being have looked at non-Western women through the lens of the Western woman. And so we need to constantly question and push back those knowledge systems that authorize non-white women.
So does that mean then, even as we look, so the demands that are made of feminism then would be split depending on where you come from or where you are culturally domiciled? Because we're saying what the demands of feminism would be from the Western world. Now, very practically at what you've talked about here, the representation of women in government, the representation of women in leadership, that perhaps the demands of Western women in the same feminism would be different from the demands of women in Africa when it comes to leadership, when it comes to representation, when it comes to government. They would be different based on what you're saying if we're looked at in a different lens. That, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, please stop me. But then are you also saying then that if we looked at it as one umbrella, then it is impossible to say that everybody can operate under the same umbrella of feminism based on the fact that culturally women are different from a global point of view?
Yeah. No, you're right. I think the simple answer is yes, you're right. The idea, the reason for the pushback is because we, for many years, have been told to operate at a certain globalized norm, globalized level. Then you sit back and you ask yourself, one, who created this global system? Who fits into this global system? Who has a voice at this global table? And that is when you begin to see that the voices of the women from places outside of the Western systems were not part of the process of creating this global standards, global norms. So within the feminist movement, there was this idea of sisterhood is global, which is great. Yeah, we're all women, we're all struggling to a large extent, the same struggle. So it's a global movement. But then you dig deeper and you realize that, okay, if you look at the layers of oppression, the layers of power hierarchies, we all may be women facing different things. But for example, the woman in any country across Africa is not just dealing with their domestic patriarchy, they are dealing with what we also call global patriarchy, global capitalist patriarchy, global imperialism. So you find that there are layers upon which the woman in the non-Western system would be facing that they in the Western systems may not. That is not to say they don't have problems. They do have their specific problems. But we cannot use one cap to fit all. So coming back to my research, I propounded a theory, and still theorizing, in an article, I think, in a book chapter in 2019, which I called matrilineal feminism, right? So this is an issue with that feminism keeps popping up in different ways. We have postmodern feminists, dominance feminists, Western feminists, all those. But it's important to keep pushing back at knowledge systems. So I propounded this idea of matrilineal feminism. And for me, it's because, once again, I am having to do research. I am having to apply the theoretical lens that I see as not fitting the explanation of the lived experiences of the African woman in law. I could apply any other theory to it. Yes, it may explain it to some extent, but the idea of knowledge production is to build up, to deconstruct, to reconstruct, and then to make things better. So I looked at this idea of African systems where we have matriarchy, which is not something that most Western feminists or societies know about. We know patriarchy, right, the man in control. But within Africa, we have pockets of different cultures that practice patriarchy. And so if you go back into our historical past, there's a lot been written about pre-colonial African systems, the colonial period, and the post-colonial, and whichever phase we are in today. I think that the idea of patriarchy, even if it is not dominant in all societies across Africa, still has a value to play in how we recognize women, how we recognize women's leadership. Now, very quickly, within African systems, we know communities that have women as chiefs.
Yeah.
We know communities that have women as queens.
Yeah.
They are decision makers. We know African systems that have had women as leaders of armies fighting in war. We know African systems that had and still have women as religious leaders. Now, if you look at religious leadership, the highest, what is called the priestess or other role, you don't see that in, let's say, Catholicism, where the Pope and the top people are men. So what is it about African systems that have been erased, that were reconstructed by Western systems, that tell us that the only way you can be your being is to be like the Western systems? And that is where we need to deconstruct and reconstruct. And that is where I came up with this idea of matrilegal feminism, putting together matriarchy, legal, and feminism to explain, once again, to your question, why is it that across the continent of Africa, despite the fact that most African countries gained independence in the late 50s, starting in Ghana and then up onto the 60s. But we have done much better in getting women into leadership in judicial positions. Take, for example, quickly, Great Britain colonized Kenya. Well, call it settler colony if you want. It colonized Ghana, it colonized Nigeria. But these countries have put women as Supreme Court presidents of the Supreme Court or Chief Justices before the UK. UK is yet to do that.
Yeah.
Ghana has had 2 women Chief Justices. Nigeria has had 1. Kenya has your first one. And of course, before the first one, you had 2 women Deputy Chief Justices. So what is it about African systems that despite the fact that we entered the game late, we've been able to promote and push women into leadership? And that's something that we need to explore.
Actually, they're just asking, then did we enter the game late? Or were we there from the very beginning? We just are retracing our own roots.
Well, we are very fast learners. What we've done is we've understood where these fellows purpose to go, and we've overtaken them.
Yeah.
We realize these fellows aren't going at the pace we'd like to.
Yeah.
So
Let's jump there faster.
We've hastened the whole process.
Time for that break. It's 8:30. Time for a Minute Maid break.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Founder and Executive Director of the Institute for African Women in Law. Tell us about this research that you conducted, the Women in Law and Leadership.
Yeah, this is a 4-nation research that we've been conducting for the past year and more. And it's on Nigeria, South Africa, Senegal, and Kenya. The broad idea was to paint a landscape of where women are in law and in leadership. So as I said, there hasn't been consistent research done in this area. And this is comprehensive because it goes deeper. We're not just looking at women's representation in numbers. Numbers matter, but then we don't want to just count the numbers and think, oh, we've arrived. We have 50 women or 40 women, so we are doing good. We want to dig deeper to find out what are the real lived experiences of these women in law. How do we get more women into leadership? And the ultimate question is, why do we need more women in leadership? And I think that the simple answer is because they have a right to be in leadership. If the world is made up of more than 50%, if African economies are made up of more than 50% of women, isn't it fair and justified that they should be equally represented in leadership? And I would like to preface that when we're looking at women in leadership or equal and equitable representation of women in leadership, it's not about... Some people look at it and think, well, it means that women are taking over. Now, I can respond quickly and say, if women are taking over, then what's wrong with that? If men have been on the ground. But for me, I always build on the system, once again, of rooting my knowledge production in African systems and realize that our communities are based on consensus. To a large extent, it's based on complementarity. And so if women are in leadership, we bring to the table what women bring. We also bring to the table new ways of thinking, diverse ways of thinking, which traditionally we may not have had because those positions were occupied by men. So if we are all together in the boat and bringing the different perspectives, I think it strengthens decision-making processes, it strengthens the policies we bring together, and it strengthens the society for the better. So that's the reason, the ultimate reason why we should have women in leadership, and the also simple reason they have a right to be there. Now, we find out that within the 4 countries we've studied, we looked at women as lawyers, women as judges, and women as professors or academics. The findings are very diverse. In some countries, we've seen progress. For example, in Kenya, we have a very diverse judiciary in terms of women's representation, over 50% inching up and in the number of women represented, and of course in leadership. And in the bar in Kenya, which is the lawyers, we also have about 42 to 45% of women as lawyers, but the leadership doesn't represent. So, for example, in the history of Kenya, we've had only one woman who was ever the chairperson of the Law Society of Kenya, Ambassador Rachel Omamo. And currently, based on our research counts, you've had 3 women who have been vice chairs. Now, that is not a good representation of the 40 to 45% of women represented at the bar or the Law Society. So more work needs to be done. We also looked in this research at the women's representation at the Office of the Attorney General and the Office of the Public Prosecutor. No woman has ever been Attorney General in Kenya. And so if you look at the academy, we also realize that in as much as more women are getting into the academy as law professors or lecturers, the numbers of women who have risen up to the level of being deans is very low. Based on the research we did, and we looked at just about 4 universities of the public and private, it's only 18% that have been deans. So you find that, yeah, the judiciary progress has been made, but then the bar and the academy, still more work needs to be done.
Do we see a situation where, in your research, you determined whether it is that women present themselves to be considered for these leadership positions, or is it that they shy away from presenting themselves? And if so, if you're talking about equitability based on capability, is it then now a discussion that perhaps goes to, should we say, the Western concept of the role of women? I say this because you brought in the issue of women taking over. The position of women in leadership in a traditional African context was always then. It was never seen as though they were taking over. Not really.
Yeah, you're right. So I think this is where the deconstruction of our mindsets needs to take place. Because in as much as most of us think we are still kind of living within the African concepts and ways of being, it's not. Yeah. We were very much, imagine the amount of years, over 100 years for countries that were colonized, but we are still in a colonized state in our ways, mindset and other. Some will call it neocolonialism, as was propounded by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, or other forms of colonization that we're still going through. So some people still operate under this notion of bureaucratic systems. The legal education system was imported into Kenya and other African countries. That is not to say before the colonized systems came, we didn't have ways of adjudication.
We did.
Right. So we have inherited systems of education that were based on the models that were brought in from whether Britain for most countries or France or other places. And we still operate under those norms that believe that leadership is something reserved for men. So we have to constantly deconstruct this notion of what leadership means and if it's always masculine. So it's something that we need to do constantly. So the question about whether women shy away from or if they are capable, once again, because of the traditional notions that, and we can't always say that they were always inherited. In as much as most of these patriarchal norms were inherited from wherever they came from, whether Great Britain or France or the US, it's also that we do also have patriarchy within African systems. So a combination of both means that, once again, the woman in African systems or any other former colonized systems, whether in Latin America or Asia, have a double bind to deal with. You're dealing with your local patriarchal systems, you're dealing with your imported patriarchal systems. So that is where it's a matter of looking into these systems of deconstruction and realizing that women do have the capabilities. Like I mentioned earlier, African countries across countries have led wars, have been leaders in economic production. Women are CEOs.
Yep.
Even if it's a market stall, she is the CEO of her market stall. They are producing and contributing to national economy development, but we don't often count their contributions. So we need to look at what is it that one has in some ways prevented or slowed down women's progression into leadership positions. And it's a combination of factors. You're right that there's some level in the book and the report we mentioned the idea of personal agency. Are you going to push forward? But I would also say within the report we identify 3 levels of explanation: the individual level, the institutional level, and the structural level. Because of this, we use this theory called intersectionality, which looks at the ways in which women, and this theory was propounded by an African-American, well, but broadly most African-American women scholars, but was really put into knowledge by an African-American social-legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, who has been credited really with the idea of intersectionality, which is to say that within the African-American context in the U.S., the experiences of the black woman, and she used it based on a particular case that went to court, are not just because she's black, it's also because she's a woman. So the idea of gender and her race intersecting means that she has more barriers to deal with. This concept has been expanded and also looking at issues of, well, it could mean that your race intersects with your gender, which may intersect with your marital status, which may intersect with your age, which may intersect with your religion, which may intersect. It goes on. Yeah. So within the African context, once again, if you're looking at this factor of how intersectionality affects, just in this case, the woman in law, it means that you're a lawyer. You've just been called to the bar. That means one, you're young. You are dealing with the age, a factor. You are probably unmarried. You are dealing with that marital or unmarital status. And then your gender. Now, within most African systems, with maybe exceptions like South Africa or a few other places, race may not be a factor, but ethnicity could be a factor, even though I haven't found it to be a strong determinant. So these factors combine at the institutional level, the structural level, and do play a role in impeding the opportunities that are available for women to rise into leadership.
You know, the understanding of what it is that is meant by this simple term leadership and how it plays on to whether it's the political arena or whether it is in civil service or, like in your case, the practice of law, there is a historical bias. No, there is a historical thought bias with regards to what women can and cannot do and what men can and cannot do. Now, these processes that you speak of and which you've researched on demystify these things. Now, I have to ask the question, since it's feminism, what's the role of men in all this and where do they fit in?
Excellent question. So men have a role to play. I have a quote I created that said that if, just to paraphrase, if we are fighting for gender equality without including men, for me, it looks like riding a car on 2 wheels. You can only go so far. You will get there, but it's going to be a painful process. It's going to be slow. Your wheels are going to be screeching. And by the time you get there, your 2 tires would be bent over, bent out. So that means that we cannot exist without complementarity. And I also have another quote that says that if men, and I'm being careful with not generalizing here because it's not all men, it's not all women, so essentialism must be at play here. If we take the assumption that men created problems for women, men created gender inequality, then shouldn't they be part of the solution? Because if they are not, then you are once again burdening women to deconstruct what they did not construct in the first place. So with that thinking in mind, men have a role to play in making sure that they also deconstruct, some men deconstruct what they understand as women's position in society, women's roles in society. I'm also happy to mention that I have met many men who understand, who have deconstructed their minds, who really never had that problem from get-go, whether it's because of their socialization or experiences. And so I always highlight those ones. And so at the Institute, we actually have a program we call the Male Allies. And the MALE is actually an acronym. I made it an acronym which means Men Advocates in Law for Equality. So you're a man, you're an advocate in law, whichever position, and you are for equality. How can you as a man use your position of authority, your position of power, which is a privilege that you have traditionally had from the day you were born, to a large extent. How can you use that power? How can you use that position of privilege to change systems within the legal profession and broadly in society in order to make it equitable and promote equality for women? And so men do have a role to play, and we invite all men to be part of it.
There is a small nuance here, and it has to do let's, for lack of a better word, let's call it an ecosystem within which we human beings exist or coexist. And then there's this little aspect of coexistence called childbearing and then rearing. And then now, the biopsychological relationships between men, boys, and their mothers, and how they're brought up. Again, the role, because what we're discussing is an eventuality, something that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But I'm going to the genesis. The country that you work and live in, there are many articles, there are many publications that have been written about a particular segment of that population, the African American, and the absentee fathers, and the effect of this absenteeism, as they call it. But if I push the absenteeism aside, would you say that there's a global notion or an acceptable global perspective as to how mothers relate to their sons and how this contributes to this discussion that we're having and which led to the research that you have?
That's a tough one to deconstruct. And so I would bring it closer home to Kenya or to the continent, Africa, where I'm sitting right now. I don't know if I can say, so if I understand your question right, and let me paraphrase my understanding, you can correct me, that women are the reason why men and boys are the way they are.
No. Women contribute significantly. You see, if I take the discussion even further, there is a compensatory element to it that's why I talked about the absenteeism of the relationships that women have with their male partners and how this then reflects on their bringing of their sons. In an African context, let me perhaps give this matter a little more flesh. You'll find a girl child is brought up to be very capable. The things that a girl child can do by the age of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are a variety. The boy child is disabled, but so again, it's upbringing.
Are you saying maybe that women who are mothers are enabling or perpetuating this way of being in boys and men, that they have a part to play in how they turn out to be?
Thank you so much. See, this is the benefit of speaking this colonizer's language.
Okay, so if that is what you're saying, thank you, Ndu, for that. I would say no.
Yes.
Why are we, you, let me just go there, saying that it's the woman's fault, it's the woman's role, and why not the man? So you see, that is where this whole idea of feminism and women's rights comes in. Why are we looking at the woman who carried that baby for 9 months, did all that breastfeeding for how many months, took care of that child, is still taking care of them until the day that whenever? Why is that burden of care still on the woman? Why wouldn't we rather reconstruct your question to say the man who is the absentee father is the one that has contributed to this problem that we have? And why are we rather saying it's a woman?
City?
Well, her point is an extremely valid one, and it's what you call a perspective. Okay? It's just a change of perspective. But let me now give you an alternate perspective. It is the socialization and the effects of it. Because if one is brought up to conduct themselves or to view that life should be conducted in a certain way, it's how they will conduct themselves. Even when there is no absentee father, the role that women on this continent believe and feel they have towards child upbringing. It's not a burden. It's something that they feel they must do. I'm not speaking about something that's theoretical. I'm speaking about the reality of how it happens. In stable
And it's not an imposition.
No.
It's a responsibility that they take.
and they take even pride in. This is what I'm
Proudly.
yes.
So much so that if it is seen, and these are things that I've seen with my eyes, Prof. So much so that if you, in some settings, if a woman were to see a man, God forbid, entering into the kitchen and picking up an onion and cutting it, it's as though they've been.
Surely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Masculation has taken place.
Yeah.
And this is the woman who is saying, oh my God, it can never happen. In the kitchen, a
Yeah.
man?
Yeah.
No, Jesus is coming tomorrow.
You're right. And I think that brings to the point the word you use, socialization.
Yes.
And this is where this whole idea of gender roles.
Yes.
Yeah, I know that within the context now we live in, the word gender has become really amorphous and all that. But gender simply means, I think it would have been better off using the word sex, which is really the biological aspects of it. But then again, some people are not comfortable with that. But it's a gender roles, which simply means that if you're a man, this is how you should behave. If you're a woman, this is how you should behave. And because even we as women have been told that the kitchen is a woman's place. The onion cutting is a woman. So even when we see a man doing those, we're like, no, there's something wrong, like you rightly said.
It's usurping my
Exactly.
job.
We all need a deconstruction. Because what is wrong with a man cooking? And some men cook better than some women.
I agree.
Some men can take care of a baby. A man cannot, by the current world we live in, maybe it's going to be happening soon, carry a baby for 9 months. But men can carry babies on their back. Men birth babies. So these are all things that if we do together and share these gender roles and realize that there's nothing wrong with, it's about the value we place on the work being done. Like you rightly said, the girls by 11 can do so much, the boys maybe not. But we still place more value on the little that the boy does and not the so many other things that the girl does.
Yeah.
Let me give you a quick example. Kenya has your first woman Chief Justice. Yeah, she has joined a long list of women across Africa. My research shows that Africa has produced more women Chief Justices and presidents of constitutional courts than any other continent. But how often do we know this? How often do we think about this? Your Chief Justice has been in office for going on 2 years now. And I can tell you, I haven't done the study yet. I'm going to do it. Based on the research I did in 2015, which we explained, looking at that time the number of women who had been in Chief Justice positions, you find that the women were equally qualified and sometimes more qualified than their male predecessors. So if we look at the legacy of any other Chief Justice and we were to compare, let's look at the current work that has been done by Chief Justice Martha Koome in less than 2 years, what she's been able to achieve, and compare that. And not to say that we're comparing for the sake of pointing fingers, but we're comparing for the sake of saying that when a woman is in a position of leadership and she is contributing to transforming systems, whether in this case justice or judicial systems, we have to look at the record, recognize, celebrate, and acknowledge the fact that the woman in leadership is changing systems for the good, and not pick at banal things that are just for the sake of sensationalizing. Women in leadership have a right to be there. The record has shown that they've done a good job in places. The research has shown that when there are more women on boards, the boards do better. With some research. So once again, I am not saying that we should engage in a game of comparison, but it's a game of recognizing, acknowledging, and giving credit where credit is due.
It's quantifying the outcomes and the outputs. Now, what needs to be done in these 4 countries that you conducted this research? You said, for example, let's just looking at Kenya, in terms of women in positions of leadership in the judiciary, it's almost coming to 50%. In the academia, it's below that. In the bar, it's below that. What needs to be done to increase that?
Yeah, it's a lot. So once again, we break the recommendations into different levels. So once again, the institutional level, the structural level, and the individual level. So just to your point, some women do still need leadership training. It's all about the socialization. We're socialized from the very get-go that leadership is for men. Some women also shy away from leadership because when a woman gets into leadership, you get all sorts of things thrown at you. So some people say, it's just not me, I don't have the time. So that individual aspect has to be. We have to also invest in training. We have to invest in programs, for example, for those in academia. It's a publish or perish. So if women are not getting the opportunities to publish because of the double burden care of childcare, and not just childcare, adult care, communal care, then they don't have the time. So how do we get more fellowships for women to be able to publish? In the bar, the Law Society would also have to have a conversation about, think about it, if about 40% of the people of the bar are women, but when it comes to elections, a woman doesn't rise up, what is the problem? And it's a national thing, right? Even in politics. What is, once again, the ways in which we women have to deconstruct our minds and support women, and also men have to deconstruct their minds to know that a woman can equally be a leader. And why are women not contesting for these positions? We need to look at those. So,
the question that comes to my mind is, yet we still find women being elected. What is it about these women, and why is it that they get elected?
The ones that get elected.
Yes, against this background of a clear bias. What do they do? What is it about them?
yeah. So within the legal profession, if I'm just looking at that, Kenya, it's only been one. So I'm going to have to figure out what made that exception outlier case. Yeah, the three deputy vice chairs society of the society we need to look at. So my simple answer would be, the extrapolating from other factors is a lot of things, other circumstances. The selection method, is a timing, is an issue of the person, is an issue of the networks they have, and then if we were to looking at politics, it's an issue of money. But in the case of this one, I think that will be my next research project. What is it about those ones that got them there? So thank you for that research
You
question.
can involve CT in that next research. Prof, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for the work that you've done. Welcome. Come back again. Come back soon to the show.
I will do. Thank you for making me feel so relaxed. Thank you.
Professor Japa Dawoni is a founder and executive director of the Institute for African Women in Law. We've been talking about women in law and leadership in those 4 countries, particularly Kenya.